What type of man developed sacrifice rituals so brutal that they terrorized even other medieval warriors? Who transforms entire families into human merchandise, separating mothers from children to sell them in distant slave markets? What kind of warrior considers possessing trophies made of human bones more sacred than any code of honor? This man was the Viking, and everything you learned about them through series and films is a romanticized lie that hides one of the most ruthless cultures in human history. Imagine that you are in a peaceful monastery on the coast of England in the year 793. It's a tranquil June morning. You're in morning prayer. The sea is calm. Suddenly, you hear a sound that will haunt your nightmares for the rest of your life. It's the noise of wooden hulls scraping on the beach sand. Then comes the war cry that paralyzes the blood in your veins, a howl that echoes pure terror. You run to the window and see something that your mind refuses to process. Enormous men jumping from long ships with axes that gleam in the morning sun. Their faces are painted with war symbols, their hair braided with bone ornaments, and their eyes shine with a determination that is not of this world. They didn't come just to plunder. They came for something much more systematic. They told you that Vikings were honored warriors, brave explorers who discovered America 500 years before Columbus. They made you believe they were simple pagans who only defended their culture against forced Christianization. But the archaeological and documentary truth is that Vikings developed the most sophisticated psychological warfare system of the Middle Ages, an industrial operation that transformed human beings into commodities, and that considered extreme intimidation a military strategy. What happened in Lindisfarne on that morning of June 8th was not just a surprise attack, it was the first test of a terror protocol that Vikings had developed specifically to break the resistance of entire communities without completely destroying them. They didn't eliminate all inhabitants. That would be economic waste. They carefully selected who would be useful, who would be transported, and who would be left to spread the story. The Anglo-Saxon chronicler Simeon of Durham, who documented survivor accounts years later, described methods that challenge our understanding of medieval warfare. Vikings had specific protocols for each type of victim. Children were destined for specialized Mediterranean markets, where wealthy families paid fortunes for young Scandinavians as status symbols. Women went through a classification process that evaluated everything from physical conditions to specific skills. But the clergy received special treatment. Vikings believed that subjugating religious leaders demonstrated the superiority of their gods over Christianity. They had developed humiliation rituals that lasted days, methods so detailed that they were recorded in Icelandic sagas as offerings worthy of Odin. Do you think I'm romanticizing? Archaeological excavations in Repton, England, revealed a Viking mass grave from 873 that contains remains of more than 250 individuals. But these are not remains of Vikings killed in battle. They are evidence of civilian victims with marks indicating systematic ritual procedures, skulls with intentional modifications, bones with patterns suggesting prolonged practices, evidence that victims were kept in captivity for extended periods. The Netflix series Vikings romanticized Ragnar Lothbrok as a complex hero in search of adventure and discovery. The historical reality is that Ragnar developed what the sagas call the Great Harvest, an industrial system of human capture that functioned like a multinational corporation of the time. His fleets were not bands of adventurous warriors. They were companies specialized in human trafficking that operated specific trade routes between Scandinavia and the prosperous slave markets of the Mediterranean world. Vikings created detailed maps not of lands to conquer, but of populations to capture. They knew exactly which communities had the most valuable human product, what time of year was best for attacks, how to transport large numbers of captives across thousands of oceanic kilometers. They were, literally, the first multinational of human trafficking. But this was just the beginning. Eric the Red did not receive this name because of the color of his hair. He received it because he developed the most efficient human marking system of the Viking era, A method of cataloging and processing captured people that used red ink made from blood to classify human products by category and market value. Born around 950 in Norway, Eric was banished from his homeland not for common murder, as many believe, but for having created what the Icelandic sagas call people farms. These were facilities where Vikings kept large numbers of captives before transporting them to international markets, and the methods Eric developed to maximize the productivity of these operations became the standard throughout Scandinavia. The Viking slavery system, known as thrall, was not an accidental consequence of their raids. It was the primary objective. Archaeologists estimate that between 80 and 90% of the Viking economy depended directly on slave labor and human trade. But Eric revolutionized this industry by transforming it from opportunistic to systematic. Before Eric, Vikings captured people during attacks and sold them in the nearest markets. Eric created something completely different. He established permanent trade routes, specialized processing centers, and even a credit system that allowed buyers to order specific types of slaves in advance. The Sagas of Eric, 13th century Icelandic documents based on oral traditions of the time, describe in detail how these operations functioned. Eric didn't attack communities randomly. He sent spies months in advance to map populations, identify valuable individuals, and plan extraction routes. He had agents in monasteries, villages, and even in other Viking communities collecting what today we would call market intelligence. The classification system Eric developed was frighteningly sophisticated. Children between 8 and 12 years old were Category A, destined for wealthy families of the Byzantine Empire who paid premium prices for exotic human pets. Skilled adolescents were Category B, sold to specialized workshops in Constantinople and Cordoba. Young and healthy adults were Category C, destined for heavy work in mines and construction. But Eric had a special category, Category S, for scholars, clerics, and educated people. These commanded the highest prices because wealthy Muslim families used them as private tutors and administrators. A literate Irish monk could be worth the equivalent of 20 common slaves. Archaeological excavations in Reykjavik revealed the remains of one of Eric's farms, underground structures that could house up to 500 people simultaneously. They found drainage systems, separation areas by category, and even what appeared to be training rooms, where captives were prepared for their final destinations. But most disturbing is that Eric didn't work alone. He created a network of partners that included other Viking leaders, Arab merchants, Byzantine officials, and even some corrupt Christian clerics. It was literally a medieval multinational corporation specialized in human trafficking. The Arabic records of Ibn Fadlan, a diplomat who visited Viking territories in 921, describe encounters with Eric's commercial representatives in markets as distant as Baghdad. They had illustrated catalogs showing different types of Scandinavian slaves available, seasonal price lists, and even quality guarantees. Eric established what Arabic sources call al-Majusiya al-Hamra, the Red Pagan Network. It was a communication system that extended from Greenland to Constantinople, allowing coordination of captures, transport, and sales across entire continents. They used a code based on runes that archaeologists still haven't been able to completely decipher today. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Eric's system was its sustainability. He didn't just capture people, he created incentives for entire communities to become dependent on providing human products. He offered protection against other Vikings in exchange for regular quotas of people. He transformed some communities into voluntary suppliers of their own neighbors. In Uppsala, Sweden, there exists a sacred tree that archaeologists call the Tree of 1,000 Secrets. Recent excavations revealed that in its surroundings were found remains of more than 900 individuals of different ethnicities and ages, all with evidence of having been kept alive for prolonged periods before being sacrificed during Viking festivals that lasted 9 consecutive days. But Uppsala was not just a religious center. It was the laboratory where Vikings perfected their methods of psychological processing of captives before transport to distant markets. What happened during those 9 days was not just religious ritual. It was the most sophisticated behavioral engineering that humanity had ever developed. The German chronicler Adam of Bremen, who visited Uppsala in 1075, described ceremonies that he called theater of despair. Vikings didn't sacrifice their victims immediately. First, they went through an 8-stage process that aimed to completely break their previous identity and rebuild them as obedient human property. In the first stage, captives were separated by family ties and mixed with people from other captured communities. Mothers were separated from children, husbands from wives, brothers from sisters. The objective was to eliminate any emotional support system that could give strength for resistance. In the second stage, they were forced to participate in rituals where they had to watch the sacrifice of other captives, while singing Viking victory hymns. Those who refused to sing were marked for the next sacrifice. Those who sang with sufficient enthusiasm earned extra food rations. The third stage involved what the sagas call blood baptism. Captives were forced to participate in rituals where they had to drink from cups made of human skulls, publicly declaring their gratitude for being chosen by Viking gods. It was a combination of psychological humiliation and religious conditioning that destroyed any remaining sense of dignity. But Adam of Bremen recorded something even more disturbing. Vikings developed specific techniques for different types of captives based on their final destinations. People destined for intellectual work were subjected to a different process than those destined for physical work. It was customization of mental conditioning, based on the slave's future function. For captives destined for wealthy families as slave tutors, Vikings used methods that preserved intellectual capacity while completely destroying the will to escape. These went through sessions where they were forced to teach Viking children, creating emotional bonds that would prevent them from attempting escape in the future. For captives destined for heavy work, the process was different. They were subjected to extreme physical resistance tests, but also to rituals that made them accept the idea that their previous existence had been inferior and that serving Vikings was an elevation of status. The most disturbing truth about Vikings is not what they did 1,000 years ago. It's how their methods became the model for practices that continue today. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas, he didn't invent the colonization system that decimated native populations. He was following a procedures manual, developed 400 years earlier by Vikings, a manual that had been preserved and refined through generations of European merchants, explorers, and conquerors. Columbus's documents, discovered in the Seville archives in 1985, make specific reference to what he calls Nordic methods of population pacification. Columbus had studied Viking techniques through Venetian and Genoese accounts that maintain detailed commercial records of Scandinavian operations in the Mediterranean. The encomienda system that Spaniards established in the Americas was an almost exact copy of the psychological conditioning system developed in Uppsala. The forced separation of families, the destruction of cultural symbols, the imposition of work as civilizing benevolence, all of this had been tested and perfected by Vikings centuries before. But Viking influence went far beyond American colonization. The cataloging and human processing methods developed by Eric the Red became the basis for what modern historians call the Great Systematization. Between 1000 and 1500, all of Europe adopted variations of Viking protocols to deal with conquered populations. The English used techniques derived from Uppsala methods during the conquest of Ireland. The French applied Viking categorization systems during the Crusades in southern France against the Cathars. The Germans incorporated Scandinavian conditioning rituals in their campaigns in Eastern Europe. What had begun as practices of a barbaric culture became official policy of Christian states. During the era of Atlantic slave trade, European merchants used manuals that were direct translations of Borg tablets. The slave processing barracks on the African coast followed the same architectural model as Viking centers in Burka. The psychological breaking techniques used on American plantations were direct refinements of methods developed in Uppsala. The Dutch company that controlled slave trade in the 17th century, the West India Company, had in its archives what they called Scandinavian Protocol, a detailed set of instructions on how to maximize the productivity of captured populations that directly cited Viking sources. But perhaps the most shocking evidence of modern Viking influence was discovered in 1945, when the Allies found in Nazi archives documents titled Studies on Historical Population Control Efficiency. These documents analyzed Viking methods, recommending their application in relocation operations in Eastern Europe. The Nazis had identified Vikings as the historical precursors of their own practices. They specifically studied Uppsala methods, Eric's categorization systems, and the psychological conditioning techniques described by Adam of Bremen. The Holocaust incorporated direct elements of human control technologies developed in Scandinavian territory 1,000 years before. Today, human rights organizations have identified at least 42 contemporary situations where armed groups use variations of Viking techniques. From refugee camps controlled by militias to modern human trafficking operations, the patterns of family separation, psychological conditioning, and categorization by value remain hauntingly similar to protocols developed in Uppsala. The 21st century human trafficking industry, which moves more than $150 billion annually, uses apps and digital technology to implement classification systems that Eric the Red would immediately recognize. The categories changed from A, B, C, S to digital codes, but the fundamental principles remain identical. The truth is that when you watch Vikings on Netflix and see honored warriors fighting for family and freedom, you are watching the greatest historical whitewashing operation ever produced. Vikings were not romantic victims of Christianization. They were the architects of dehumanization systems that continue functioning 1,000 years later. Every time a family is separated at the border, every time refugees are categorized by economic value, every time entire populations are displaced for pacification, we are seeing direct echoes of innovations developed by men like Eric the Red in territories we now call Scandinavia. The Viking legacy is not the Oslo museums or television series. It's an operations manual for systematic dehumanization that never stopped being used. And if you want to understand how these practices influenced the formation of the countries we know today, leave a comment below. Because this story has developments that will change your vision about practically everything you believe about modern civilization.